the moment I was done with Public Enemies in 2004, I think it was, I wanted to write about Old West gunfighters. Look, once you've gone back to the 1930s to write about the most famous criminals, you're already glancing back to the only time that can compare in terms of famous people who are criminals and guns are prominent, and that's the Wild West, right? So I knew from the word go that I wanted to write about gunfighters, some of whom were outlaws, but not all of whom. By gunfighter, I define gunfighter as anyone who's in the Old West who was involved in a exchange of gunfire with another civilian, not involving Native Americans, not involving soldiers. This had to be civil business, if you will. So the problem, of course, is there's nothing that binds them all together. There's nothing that really binds Wyatt Earp to Jesse James or to John Wesley Hardin. There's no single story like there was in Public Enemies, but I knew it had to be a single story. I can't write, look, every book on gunfighters until this one has mostly been 17 chapters on 17 gunfighters. And I can't do that. I can't write just one more. I mean, candidly, to get paid what I want to be paid, it needs to be one story. It took me 13 years to figure out what that was, not full time. I was writing other things. I always knew I wanted to do it, but my editor challenged me. He said, look, if you could find a way to tie it all together, we'll do it. But you need something so that this is not episodic. And he was right, of course. So anyway, all I could the first thing I figured out, and this was easy, was they were all, when you look at the big five gunfighters, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, John Wesley Hardin, Jesse James, and Billy the Kid. They're all at large during the same period of time. Roughly 1865, which was the first nationally recognized gunfight, the first one that made gunfighting a thing, until Butch and Sundance got on the boat to South America in 1901. And I decided to call that the gunfighter era. There are so many famous gunfighters, people that we're still talking about 150 years on. What caused them to be so famous and to cause these behaviors? So when you look at where gunfighters came from, there's only one people in one place where people were regularly shooting each other in civilian situations before the Civil War, and that is in duels, primarily in the antebellum South. So obviously the duel itself did not go out onto the frontier. We don't, people weren't sitting there, firing at, pin paces. But what I came to believe is that what was important about the behaviors that caused duels was the old Southern codes of male honor, that your measure as a man, your measure in society is exclusively what people think of your honor. And if your honor is impugned, if somebody says you cheated on your wife or you drank bad coffee or whatever it is, you have an obligation to strike back violence, and even with violence and even with deadly violence. And that's what we saw in the Old South. And what I posit in this book is that, those behaviors moved west into Texas, where they're very pronounced before and after the Civil War. But Texas went through an enormously violent, easily the most violent of Reconstruction period of all the Southern states. And the violence that swept Texas in the decade after the Civil War, there are academic analyses that will say it was the single most violent period of civilian gun violence in the lower 48 in American history. While we can generalize about some of the behaviors that cause these gunfights, a lot of it is men being insulted over a gun, over a woman, over a drink, over a parcel of land. The gunfighters individually are so different. Hickok was the first and the most famous for a long time, certainly during his life. He was a serial fabulist. The first accounts of his career suggested he had killed over 100 white men, when the actual number would appear to be closer to 2. He later, in part because of all this publicity began to build a career as a notable lawman and gunfighter. But there's so much that we just don't. And my favorite is probably Wyatt Earp, because this is a book that tells the stories of all the major gunfighters and gunfights, and many that you've never heard of as well. And so a lot of these people, let's just say, are not people that you want to be sitting next to at the dinner table. They're not people you'd want to babysit your kids. Wyatt Earp, maybe you could. I mean, he's really the moral center at the middle of the legend. And, some people, especially those who've just been raised on the Wyatt Earp movies the last 50 years, may not appreciate how deeply controversial he was, because while he held to the laws for most of his career, at the end, when he didn't, things got pretty nasty. And then there's the question of his origins, the fact that he began as a pimp, and that we now know, thanks to new research in the 21st century, that for the extent of all his time on the frontier, he was an escaped federal prisoner. So there's a lot new about these guys. I mean, just to look at someone like John Wesley Hardin, the most famous gunfighter in Texas history, killed somewhere between 25 and 42 people before he turned 21. I mean, each of them is fascinating, and that doesn't even start in on the ones that you've never heard of. One of my favorite corners of the book is a chapter on something that is probably the deadliest feud in American history. You say feud now, and everybody thinks Hatfield and McCoy. Hatfield and McCoy was dwarfed by the feuds out west, especially this one called the Pleasant Valley War in the 1880s in Arizona, which was not just one family against another, but it had like 8 different factions, but it was mostly one cattle family versus one sheep family. And there were so many gunfights of note. I'm thinking of one that is primarily notable because of the debate, half seriously, about whether wild pigs came out to eat the bodies. But my favorite of those is another kind of the high point of that Pleasant Valley War is a gunfight that I think is mostly famous to aficionados. And it involved a house full of Texas cowboys who had run cattle into Arizona. They're in Holbrook, Arizona in 1887. And one of them had a warrant out for him. And when one of my favorite gunfighters named Commodore Perry Owens walked up to this little bungalow with a Winchester, and that's all he had. And Commodore Perry Owens is interesting because the one picture of him that everybody uses, he's got every gun under the sun on him, big, wide, round brimmed hat, but this incredible hair, this orange hair that flows down past his elbows. As I say in the book, he looks like David Crosby at a dude ranch. He comes to the door, and the guy he wants, Andy Blevins from Lino, Texas, is standing there, and Andy tries to duck him. And Perry Owens shoots through the door, downs him. He falls. He backs up into the front yard. One of the Blevins brothers opens another door, bang, shoots him. Another cowboy jumps out a window, bang, takes him down. All of which is kind of interesting until what makes it sad, really sad, when Andy Blevins' 15-year-old brother, Sam Houston Blevins, runs out to avenge his brothers with his mother clinging on to him behind, and he's got a gun, and Perry Owens fires his Winchester for the 5th and final time and kills the 15-year-old boy. He killed 3 people with 5 shots. Clay Allison may have been the most feared next tier gunfighter on the Old West. And by next tier, I mean someone just a notch below Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, someone whose name is largely forgotten today. One of the things Allison was a rancher. He was a cattleman on the early Texas and then the early New Mexico frontier. He had a ranch out towards Cimarron, east of Taos. One of the things that's interesting about him is he was unstable. He was, according to mustering papers that his biographer Chuck Parson found, he was drummed out of the Confederate Army because of episodes he had that seemed like epilepsy, in which he would just kind of go nuts and fire his gun at everybody. He famously rode his horse through the streets of Mobeetie, Texas, naked, for reasons, wearing nothing but a gun belt in a hat, for reasons nobody's been able to figure it out. There are all sorts of legends about Clay Allison, but beginning in the mid-'80s, there were a series of gunfights during fights over land in what's called the Colfax County War there in New Mexico, in which Allison was involved in a series of documented gunfights. The one that I smile when I think of is he was having a disagreement with a Texan. They're always Texans, named Chunk Colbert, and they had had some type of argument, and so they sat down to share a meal, to share lunch there at the hotel in Cimarron. I think it's the St. James. And of course, by and by, Colson pulls his gun, gets the first shot and misses, at which point, of course, Allison takes the next shot and hits Colson in the face and kills him. And when the reporter asked him afterwards, why'd you sit down to lunch with the man you were about to kill? And he famously said, because I didn't want to send him to hell on an empty stomach. Billy the Kid is a tough one for people, because unlike Wyatt Earp, who we hold up as this paragon, or some of these guys who you kind of know what to think about, there's an enormous amount of ambivalence around Billy the Kid. I could slice Billy the Kid's known provable story 16 ways and give you 16 versions of Billy the Kid in 16 different books. I could write you a Billy the Kid that was a murderer, a thief, and a snitch, all of which he was, and you'd still like him, because I could write a second book that emphasizes his loyalty to his friends, his daring, things that people tend to like. I end up, I'm not very judgy about any of these guys, at least in terms of their value to society. In the end, on Billy the Kid, I come down to this. He was an 18, 19-year-old orphan. His mother had died, stepfather abandoned him, who was trying to make his way on the frontier the only way he knew how, and the only talents he had were with a gun. And he became first a feudist in the famous Lincoln County War, which he barely managed to survive, but then became not an outlaw. So many people want to think of Billy the Kid as like a bank robber. Well, not only was he not a bank robber, there were very few bank robberies on the Old West frontier because there just wasn't much money there. He was a cattle rustler, which was the main business of criminals, most criminals in the Old West. It was when he finally crossed the most powerful Texas cattlemen that they hired or brought in Pat Garrett and two other Texans to bring him down. And I will say that writing the story of Billy the Kid in this book was the first time I ever really understood it, because it's complex. And you don't know, there's so many moments in Billy the Kid's story where you just don't know what to think of him. But from the books that I write, the one thing I want to entertain people, and at the end of the book, if they want to say that they've learned something, if they want to say that they've derived some lesson, great. But the one thing I know is I'm not going to tell you what that lesson ought to be.
How many people do you figure he actually killed in total?
Oh, now see, I've got to come up. I'd have to come. I can think of 4 that are documented, and to that you'd easily double. Just thinking about others that we don't know about. But I believe off the top of my head, the provable number is 4. Just looking at the Lincoln County War, it was a paramilitary type thing where he would be a member of the regulators, and there would be 15 of them fighting 40 of the, let's just say, bad guys. And who knew, how many people got shot when they're firing this way and that way. The thing is, there were no Harvard professors around there taking notes. And most of them, with the incredible exception of John Wesley Hardin, most of them did not leave behind an autobiography.
Were he and Pat Garrett really friends?
I don't think so. They clearly overlapped. They both liked it there in Fort Sumner. We know that Billy was having an affair with Pat Garrett's, sister-in-law, and that Pat Garrett ran before he became the sheriff of Lincoln County. He was a bartender there in Fort Sumner, and there are only 2 bars. So you figure they had to have had a nodding acquaintance, but there's no evidence that I've ever found that really suggests Young Guns 2, i.e. that they were friends and how awful it was that Pat had to betray him. I mean, it's a story so good, people just are dying to tell it, but I haven't found much historical evidence to back it up.